Good morning, and thanks for joining us today at the Fitzwater Forum at the Marlin Fitzwater Center for Communications for another Fitzwater Forum on This is What Democracy Looks Like. We're taking your questions on email form, so keep them coming in. We're getting a ton of them from a variety of different schools. This is a continuation of a conversation from the first Fitzwater Forum on civility in presidential election discourse that took place right before the election. Today on our panel we have Dr. Mary Kelly, a professor of history here at Franklin Pierce. She's the author of Ireland's Great Famine in Irish American History, Enshrining a Fateful Memory. We also have Dr. Christina Cliff. She's an assistant professor of political science and a peer reviewer of the Journal of Perspectives on Terrorism, presented Making Sense of the Election, Interpreting the 2014 Results and Looking Ahead to 2016. We also have Dr. Alan Racklin, an associate professor of sociology, who authored Power and Politics in American Political Culture and Encyclopedia, and also News as a Hegemonic Reality, American Political Culture and the Framing of New Accounts, and also Professor Paul Jenkins, who's the university librarian, who authored The Beatles, Will You Read My Book? So what we're going to be doing is each panel member will have about 3 or 4 minutes to kind of make some opening statements on the question, this is what democracy looks like, and then we'll be taking your email questions afterwards. Dr. Mary Kelly, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. Good morning, and it's great to be part of this panel at the Fitzwater Center. I am Mary Kelly, and as you've heard, I teach history here at Franklin Pierce. So when this project emerged, it made sense for me to kind of adopt a historical perspective on it. And I want to begin with maybe 2 points. And the first might be to make the argument for the position that it's useful to take a historical perspective on the issue of democracy and what it looks like now. And in making the point that it's useful, I would start with the idea that there's always been a tension, I think, between the idea of the original ancient Greek idea of power to the people and how that plays out among people, as I say, in the classroom who are not in power, and the set of factors that tend to counter that impulse. If we look at the evolution of democracy as a concept over time, we see that tension evolve in a variety of ways. And I think it's good to look at that process and to see the flashpoints over time, ever since the notions of ancient Greek democratia, through the Middle Ages and the discoveries, the Enlightenment, up through the revolutions, American Revolution, French, Russian, and then into the 19th century and the formation of structures in democracy today that are more familiar to us. People in power have not willingly, as I wrote, divested themselves of their particular spheres of power. So it's been incumbent on groups and individuals to push against those forces in order to propagate and really clarify what we understand today as democracy. So I do think it's instructive and even incumbent upon us to take a look back and try to inform ourselves about the different ways and the different mechanisms that have produced democracy as we know it today and as we understand it. And it's good for us to get some context, I think, to inform our thinking today as we encounter the stresses and challenges that are upon us. And the second point I would make is that on a more individualized level, I think history, our own personal history, informs our approach to democracy. The family we grew up in, the geographic, the economic, racial, ethnic, gendered, all of those different spheres inform how we think politically and our approach to democracy. And I think it's important to have some sense of literally where we're coming from if we're to understand our own thought process and our own frames of mind today. So I'll stop there, but I hope we can come back to some of those historical benchmarks and watersheds as we continue.
Nice. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. Next we'll hear from Dr. Christina Cliff.
Yeah. Thanks for having me today. I'm excited to be a part of this event. I'm a conflict specialist for my research, so I study all the bad stuff that goes on. War, genocide, terrorism, sub-state conflicts. And for me, that really plays into my sphere of understanding of what democracy looks like, because I look at all the times when democracy fails or democracy doesn't exist and how democracy impacts all of these events. And so for me, one of my favorite quotes is from Winston Churchill, who said, "Democracy is the worst form of government ever, except for all the others that have been tried." Democracy is always a mess. It's messy, it's conflictual, and Professor Kelly mentioned the tension that goes into democracy between the haves, the have-nots, and the want-to-haves. And I think that's an important facet of this. What does democracy look like? It looks like all of that. It looks like everything and nothing all at the same time, and the different trends and patterns we see over time are completely dependent on the people, and the people that want to be involved, the people that don't want to be involved, and the people that aren't sure how to be involved. And I think as we go through this panel today, you're going to hear about what is important about our democracy, what isn't working, what is working, and what maybe you can do to become more involved. And I'll leave it there, because we're going to talk a lot more about some of the current tensions, I think, in our events.
Thank you, Dr. Cliff. And we'll hear next from Dr. Alan Recklin.
Thank you. As a sociologist, I'm particularly interested in political culture, how it is that we come to understand our experience in society, particularly with regard to power and influence on that experience. So obviously I'm interested in democracy, how we understand what democracy means historically in the context, and in the forces that influence our contemporary understanding. We often hear the phrase, one person, one vote, when we talk about democracy. And the idea there is that each person is of equal influence and power in determining an election. But democracy isn't an event. It's not an election. I would suggest that democracy is a process. It's a system. And what we need to understand is, and we need to examine, is what issues are being voted on? How is it determined what those issues are? How are the issues identified? Who gets to identify those issues? Who gets to articulate them? Who gets to discuss, identify, examine responses to those issues once they're articulated? Democracy requires, I would say, equal opportunity and power throughout the process, not simply at the polling place. And that equal opportunity, in turn, requires more than a formal political equality. Instead, it requires a relative equality throughout the institutions of society. So an opportunity, or relatively equal opportunity, to shape our understanding of our experiences. That nobody should monopolize, no group should monopolize or have disproportionate power on explaining social experiences. We should have equal opportunity to communicate with others about those experiences, potentially to form coalitions with similarly interested people. And we should have equal opportunity to consider, develop, and promote possible responses to those experiences. So elections are, in some sense, the end or toward the end of the democratic process. They don't define the entirety of the process. Because our institutions are all connected, our opportunity in one institution is going to affect our opportunities in others. So our opportunities in politics are influenced by our opportunities in the economic system and our opportunities in the education system. So democracy, rather than being understood as an individual event, a simple process within political institutions, I think needs to be understood in a larger context of society and requires a more equal society. Democracy doesn't look like any single event, whether it's a protest, this is democracy, what democracy looks like, a vote. Democracy is a system, a larger process that requires relative equality throughout all institutions, not only those institutions that are explicitly political. And again, I hope you'll have an opportunity to pursue those ideas as we go along.
Thank you, Doctor. And finally, we'll hear from Professor Paul Jenkins.
Yeah, I have a little different perspective on things here. I'm the university librarian here at Franklin Pierce University. I'd like to start with a statement from Thomas Jefferson. He wrote that wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. And so if we talk about this idea of a well-informed citizenry, how do they become well-informed? Well, one way is they can go to institutions of higher education. And while at those institutions, librarians can help them become informed citizens. We practice something called information literacy, which is the ability to find, evaluate, and then use information well. And this is particularly challenging these days because there's so much information available to everybody. And unlike the old days where you could trust information from published sources, today it comes at us from all different angles. Particularly through social media, there were some studies done recently that show that more than half of Americans get their news from social media. And when they get this news, they don't really know how to evaluate it. They can't always tell if it's a ruse, as in something like The Onion, or if it's just somebody's opinion. So what we've created is something called the credibility continuum. I really like that phrase. And it's a spectrum. So it shows that there is, on one end of the spectrum, there's sensational news that's designed to get people's attention or to sell newspapers. Then there's merely somebody's personal opinion, where somebody has an axe to grind. Then there's an advocacy group who's advocating a certain viewpoint. Then there's a general news magazine like Time that has things on a fairly basic level. Then there's what we call substantive news, something like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. And finally, there's information that comes from scholarly journals. And what we do as librarians is try to get people to use, obviously, the best information sources and to avoid the other information sources. Again, recognizing that one of the problems today is that even students at universities cannot recognize the difference between these different sources of information. So that's kind of the angle I'll be looking at things with today, and I'm really interested to hear the questions that are going to be coming from our student participants.
Sounds like we have a really fun and engaging panel of experts today. And so we're going to open up some questions to our email list. Thanks for your questions. Keep them coming in. We're getting tons of them.
We are getting tons of them.
Dr. Cliff, do you have any good ones that you want to start with?
They're all good ones. First of all, let me say that these high school students are doing an amazing job with the questions.
Awesome.
You all should come to Franklin Pierce and come to my classes and do some more of this. But kind of going along the lines of what everybody has been talking about here is from Conval, Izzy Lehigh at Conval asks, why should civility be linked to democracy and politics? When we talk about what democracy looks like, where does civility fall into that category, that case?
I could leap in there with the comment that if you study politics within the popular culture, something that you will see very soon is the way that public representatives address one another. You'll hear the honourable gentleman, the honourable lady from the great state of whatever it is. There's an overt politeness, courteousness in the way our leaders address each other on a taking that as a general perspective. They know they will engage, they know the process will be contentious, and they know they will not agree on much of what they discuss and deliberate. But I think a very key aspect of the political system, certainly that exists in the United States and certainly in Western Europe, is that kind of demonstrative layer of civility that pervades. And it's very necessary because then when that degenerates, you see a very unsettling set of scenes. There was a scene in Texas, I think, over the weekend, where some representatives resorted to what used to be called fisticuffs on their House floor, and that's symptomatic of the chaos and the decline of this very vulnerable condition of democracy that we have. So I'll just kind of start with that it's they're not doing that for nothing. They're not addressing each other that way just because they were raised that way. That is a very crucial dimension of the political process, and it's kind of the oil, I think, that enables that wheel to turn. So I'll throw that out too.
Yeah, and it's obviously not just Texas, but we saw an example in Montana recently as well. And I mean, let's try to reason with the head instead of just speaking from the heart. Certainly, speaking from the heart is important, but we need to control our emotions in order to express our thoughts most accurately, I think.
Real quickly, I actually don't feel terribly comfortable with the idea of civility. And that's because I think manners are important, and I think that it's correct to suggest that it creates an environment that is at least more pleasant and probably less dangerous. Yeah. But I would rather use the term substantive rather than civil. I would like our political discussions to be substantive, which gets to this idea of from the head rather than the heart. We can exhibit great manners, but the discussions can be rather vacuous, and power can be hidden in those formalities. And that's why rather than civility, I would prefer that we focus on substantive political discussions.
That brings up an interesting question from Karina Wright at Conval. She says, could the incivility in our democracy cause it to fall apart? And so is there a connection between some level of civility or potentially do we need the manners? Do we need some sort of level of acceptable interaction in order to continue with democracy?
Well, I think we need structures by which to engage in democratic practices, I'll put it that way. And one problem now is that technology, the onward march of technology, has changed how we used to think of that connection between technology and democracy. Quote, the founding fathers wrote. Many of them were excellent writers and speakers and thinkers, but writing was the mechanism by which they articulated their ideas outward. FDR, for example, mastered use of the radio, as we know, as a mechanism. JFK, TV, and ever since, to bring us up to the present day, the use of social media and Twitter, for example. So a much different approach to engaging with the electorate is evident in our own day. So we're constantly dealing with I think, the evolution of democracy as a process, and part of that is you know, identifying the requisite structures that will best enable us to perform that and to engage in substantive deliberation and allow us to make real progress. And it's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, I think I like to think of social media as very convenient, and convenience trumps thoroughness. And I think that consumers of information have to work harder, and they have to start changing their habits if we're going to have a more informed electorate and practice democracy more effectively. We can't just take the first thing that comes across our news feed and take that as gospel. We need to investigate the issue in more depth. I think there's this sort of mental laziness that's come over a lot of Americans and certainly citizens all over the world, where we just take the first thing that's thrown at us and we run with that instead of taking some time to think about the issue more deeply and investigate it more thoroughly.
That actually adds in. You guys are just, I keep getting more and more questions, and they seem to tie together. From Jaden Casper at Pinkerton Academy, they asked the question: in our current democracy, do you believe that the governed still has power, as much power as in previous years? Many people, especially students, new voters, feel voiceless. Are we? And to Professor Racklin's point, elections aren't democracy in its entirety. It's a larger process. Maria Sorgan asked, many citizens feel that voting is their only chance to be a bigger part of this bigger process. What other aspects of democracy are available to people, and how can people become involved aside from voting? Are we voiceless, and how do we get involved if we feel voiceless?
I think we need to distinguish between potential and experience. I think that many of us do feel powerless or voiceless. I think, though, that even in times when that may be the dominant feeling, there's the potential for voice, for influence. And this then kind of leads into the question of what can be done other than voting. There are all kinds of collective actions that people can engage in. We as Americans in our culture tend to view the reality as simply that of the individual. But politically and power generally is really found in institutions and collective action. So purposefully, intentionally organized political groups can influence the agenda, influence what we're talking about. Much social change in the United States, and certainly around the world historically, has not been through the ballot box. And I'm not talking about violent revolution even, I'm talking about massive collective action. In recent American history, if we look at the civil rights movement, if we look at the anti-war movement and with regard to Vietnam, when we look at the gay rights movement, we look at the changes in our attitudes and the laws with regard to sexual identity and so on. Those did not start in legislative halls. Those started by collective action of citizens. So there's no limit on the kind of potential. And I would just say that if we want to broaden beyond the borders of the United States, we take some of the most totalitarian regimes, South Africa and apartheid, the Soviet Union. Again, the change was not simply through the ballot box. The change was through collective, what is sometimes called extra-political action. We have to become aware of those. And one of the ways to become aware of those movements, those opportunities, is through the kind of awareness of the literature, what people are writing about in terms of their experiences, in terms of their analysis, in the kind of publications and communications that Paul was talking about.
And just to pick up on a thread from Professor Cliff earlier when you said that democracy was messy in its nature. Another tension that we see today, an ongoing one, is that between, on one hand, we have striven towards equality on many of the levels that Professor Racklin just referenced, in terms of groups that have been historically disenfranchised or excluded from power in one way or another. We have taken steps to address that and redress those situations. And we have made great progress. Women, African Americans, Native Americans. If you look at historically marginalized groups in terms of political power, certainly you see much progress made. But the other side of that coin comes in those questions. Many of us feel powerless or feel we don't have a voice. So on one hand, we've had these steps taken to level the playing field and to ensure greater parity between groups of people. But on the other hand, there may be an expectation of greater participation as a result of that leveling in the political process. And that's not as easily achieved, or arguably that has not been achieved. And I think a lot of people today, maybe particularly young people, think there was some golden age, some democratic golden age in the past, whether their parents' or grandparents' time. And there really was not. It's been a struggle all along, and certainly American history shows that very clearly. So I think we're dealing with that very interesting set of conflicts between the progress we have made and the conflicts that still exist, kind of within that sphere.
Yeah, I think, and to just kind of throw my own 2 cents in there, you have to argue. You have to. If you feel voiceless, you need to find your voice in some way, shape, or form. Because democracy isn't. We give power to the people, but it's not just power to the people to protect themselves from their government. It's power to the people to protect themselves from other people. There's a very real danger of, totalitarianism by the masses, not just the government. And so when you struggle, when you feel voiceless, when you feel there's an issue that is not being addressed, it really is up to citizens to take part and to be engaged, to be informed, as Professor Jenkins mentioned. Democracy requires the people to be part of the democracy. And one of the questions we had from Taylor Marchman at Pinkerton was, how does the ongoing election drama affect how the millennials view the election next time they have to vote? And that's a real question. If you were turned off, if you thought that the last election cycle was nasty and brutish, and not short, what does that do to your next efforts? And some of y'all are high school kids, maybe getting ready to vote for the first time in your next presidential election. How does that affect you? Well, what I would say is, don't let it remove you from the process, all of the different processes, including election, but getting involved on different levels. How do you guys see this new election cycle impacting voters, whether it's millennials, whether it's older generations?
I would make no predictions. I'm not in the prediction business, and when I do make them, I'm usually wrong. But while I argue that democracy isn't simply about elections, I would also observe that Americans typically do not vote. Even in presidential elections, we hover just over 50% of the eligible voters participate. And if we look at the election, whatever your response to the most recent presidential election is, if those people who did not vote became informed and did participate, the outcome could be completely different. It could be a landslide, overwhelming landslide for either of the candidates, or even for make a third or fourth party candidate a significant challenge. So I would caution millennials and all the rest of us rather than look at any particular election and get disgusted and drop out. Instead, minimally vote in an informed way. And again, we could change the outcome of elections and change the agenda, change the things that we're talking about if more people did vote. Again, I hope that that's not the only thing we do, but we don't even do that very efficiently or well.
In an earlier discussion, we had, I think Alan drew a comparison between being skeptical and being cynical. You cannot be cynical because then you give up. But you can be skeptical and don't just take for gospel what one candidate says. Examine, go beyond just what the person is telling you. Spend some time with people who don't have your view. I think one thing that happens is people hang around too much people who feel the same way they do, and so they never expand their views, they never entertain the opposing viewpoint. Spend some time with some of your classmates who feel differently than you do. Get exposed to different viewpoints, and then that'll help you make up your own mind and clarify your own opinions. But again, I would really stress that, sure, be skeptical, but do not be cynical.
I also find that's really important to do the same things on social media. I think our feed begins to feed ourselves what we want to hear, and stepping out of that kind of social media realm is really important to take on those points of view, like you talked about earlier. Then also the idea of civil disobedience, for the most part, too, is something that's important. I think we're seeing reactionary measures that are getting, promoted in the news more than we are we seeing more levels of civil disobedience. We were seeing these mass marches, but then what happens after that we're not getting enough information on. But we're seeing these fights in the different state senate houses, and they become sensationalized. And I think that's a real danger for our society in a lot of ways.
That's an interesting point. And the students in American government at Tri-City Christian Academy just sent us a question kind of along those same lines about hearing different voices. They said, some of us are heading to college next year, and it seems that students on campuses with conservative voices are often shut down and events often protested. How is our democracy to survive if voices that are different are not being allowed equal time?
I think that echoes that same point. They do need equal time and to be managed equally, and to have those civil forums in a lot of ways in order to respond to them.
I think one of the challenges are that well, in the question there's suggesting conservative voices are shut down and there isn't space. The more liberal or progressive voices are claiming that there isn't space for them either, and that the conservative voices have drowned them out continually, and that's why they're responding as they do. We all see each other, we all see ourselves as victims. And again, I think that if we truly believe in democracy, we're really talking about ongoing, continual discussions, challenging each other rather than silencing each other. We aren't all victims. Neither are we all perpetrators. And I think we'd have to open up the space for discussion.
That term debate by itself, I think, is very important, and we've not lost that concept in the millennial generation and younger, but I think it's important to cultivate the ability to debate and to engage on contentious issues. There can be ground rules and there can be a process for that, but in a world where we emphasize teamwork and group work, and we put a lot of stress on that kind of skill building, it's also, in terms of democracy, very important for people to be able to engage on a topic, to be able to use libraries and information resources to build a case. I know we tried to do that in many different classes at Pierce, but I find increasingly, I'm here 20 years, and I see over time students are a little more reluctant to kind of step out on a limb in a class and go against the grain. And I think a lot of this is about basic building blocks, such as encouragement to do that. Also, know who your local representatives are. That's a very simple measure of your approach to democracy. Do you know who your local town or city representatives on the state level are? Are you willing to step forward and engage on that level? That's another step for the future. So basic building blocks, I think, are essential, practical, and necessary to foster a better democratic process.
I think the point about the meaning of debate is an important one. Debate doesn't mean serial soliloquies. We emote, we say how we feel. Debate is engagement, responding to each other, asking questions of each other, challenging each other. And the challenge is the challenge of reason. It's not ad hominem. It's not a challenge directed at insulting individuals. It really gets back to this idea of the head and reason, and examining our ideas, explaining them, justifying them, or providing support, or acknowledging that we don't have sufficient support at times. And we're interested in an issue. An issue is important, but we don't have enough grasp of the issue. We don't have enough information to have a conclusion. That's part of the discussion also.
It's interesting because one of the things that I hear a lot from my students is, you know, the polarization of people, in a sense that we're not working through reason and debate. We're working through emotion and labels. And one of the questions we got from Travis Fisher asks about the impact of party loyalty and party polarization. Has it contributed to the growing hostility between people? And is it affecting the democratic processes in government where party loyalty trumps serving the people? Do you guys see that as a contemporary problem, as a increasing problem, the polarization of the parties and party labeling and party affiliation?
Well, I'd like to hear Mari's thoughts on that, since she's kind of one of the experts on the panel. My feeling, I was born in 1961, and my feeling is that there was more work across the aisle, as they say, between the two dominant parties than there is today. And I just wonder if Mari thinks that's an accurate observation, or if I'm romanticizing the past at all.
If that were a graph, it would rise and fall historically. Party fortunes have ebbed and flowed depending on all the factors, all the variables, leadership, economic conditions, national issues, you know, depending on whatever was in the news at that particular point. If you go back to the founding fathers, it took approximately 40, 50 years for the party system to establish, the party system we know today. And in the United States, it's been relatively stable. You can use that kind of language about it, which means, to your point, that that the leading actors, if you will, in that drama have enjoyed a certain level of security, predictability. If I do this, then this will happen. If I reach across the aisle, then these are the scenarios that are likely to happen. So I think there's been a sufficient measure of stability in the American system, certainly over time. such that you have individuals. The most commonly cited in the modern era is Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. You'll very often hear, and multiple books and articles have appeared on their interactions. So in the 1980s, the efforts on both sides to engage in the very real Cold War related, economic related, Star Wars, anyone? All of the gamut of issues that they confronted, and the conclusion or the verdict is favorable in terms of that interaction and their ability to engage in debate, as you laid it out there, and achieve the best outcome for the country. That doesn't always happen. Again, there are many variables that kick in terms of why and how that process evolves. But if you read anything about politics at all, the word compromise is very much a characteristic and a feature, and even today and tomorrow, when the New Hampshire House will engage in a set of bills that are extremely contentious and problematic, and try to get a budget passed that will involve a heck of a lot of compromise, we see the real need for that. So on one level, we have to be informed. From that level, we have to have evidence to support our arguments. We have to be able to make a case. And from there, we have to be able to hear other perspectives and engage with them, also, which is a necessary component of effective politics. And from there, we have to attempt to find solutions and find ways to effect change as we need to do. So, to my mind, we're in this ongoing process. It's an evolution. We're not done, and we won't be anytime soon. But it's compelling and captivating, and I think it will continue to be. And I hope the millennials will rise to it, as I expect they will.
I think there is a good deal of evidence of the ebb and flow of the significance of party loyalty and so on. I would caution, though, the pining for the old days when there were these masters of compromise. And clearly they played an important role. But I think we also have to look beyond individuals and look at some of the structure, the redistricting and gerrymandering, and the kind of magnet that has served for population movement in different areas of the country. And I think that there are structural issues that we have to look at and figure out how to deal with if we're going to begin to respond to the deep cleavages between parties and party loyalty.
Well, just because it's a compromise doesn't mean it's a good solution, I guess, would be the other
Mm-hmm.
point I would throw out. A compromise means somebody gave something up. Now, you want to be a little careful about saying, well, you should never give anything up, but then at the same time, you want to be a little bit cautious about being willing to compromise for the sake of compromise and for the sake of reaching across the aisle. So to Professor Racklin's point, I agree with that. But we've got time for a couple more questions, and I noticed some themes showing up here about the role of the media, particularly in this last election cycle, and Amanda from Pinkerton Academy asked, who regulates what is published regarding presidential candidates or presidents? And realistically, nobody does, unless there's a specific legal component involved. But what do you think about the role of the media, whether or not there should be some, I don't want to say laws, because then we bump up against the free speech and free press issue, But should there be some consensus on how politics should be covered, how politics should be addressed within the media?
I wouldn't argue that there should be some consensus. I would argue that there should be a tremendous amount of discussion and introspection. I think that this is a fascinating question today, in that what ought the media to do in its coverage. For example, not only in terms of the election, but that since the election, every day there's some kind of extraordinary event. And it's covered breathlessly. And there's not an ability or a willingness to step back and look at the big picture. The scandal of the day may divert our attention from larger phenomenon that are going on that are much more significant in terms of the future of the country and the future of our experiences in the country. And media, commercial media, are in the business of getting eyeballs, whether it's on their site or their newspaper or their TV station or whatever. And spectacle gets eyeballs. Spectacle, though, may not inform us of what's going on in the world and may not alert us to issues of significance. And I think that's something that we as citizens and people in the media need to consider. And I don't have a ready answer to this, but I think it's something that we need to be examining very closely. The big picture gets lost in the day-to-day, and that ain't good.
And maybe as consumers of information, we can help influence that. Let's not continue to flock to the sensational. Let's try to get to the substantive issues. Tough, very tough issue. Yeah, I think, again, it gets back to my earlier point about changing your mindset and your habits. I think we fall into these habits of going for the sensational. And if we continue to do that, then nothing's going to change because they're going to see that that's what we gravitate towards. So again, we have to change our habits of thinking and the way we consume information.
Yeah, how many of us are aware of Trump grabbing the hand of his wife or not, as opposed to what was actually discussed at those meetings and what might be some outcomes and concerns that came out of the meetings.
That's a good point.
Yeah, and of course, the added complication that politicians are very much aware of how they can use distractions to deflect from an issue or something that they don't want highlighted in the media. So it becomes even more important to read the fine print and to sensationalism is of course nothing new. We've always had that. There have always been the tabloid versions of the news, and that's not going to stop anytime soon. But I think what is a little different now, what has kind of shifted in the culture a little bit in terms of how we educate ourselves and the information resources we have. The university level, the college level, the third level used to be a bastion for that reading of the fine print and for that deep-seated deliberation and introspection, as you said, and publications emanating from faculty used to provide that basis, if you will, or that foundation for democracy. And of late, with the increasing emphasis on career tracks and majors as vehicles for very specific job opportunities, something has shifted in the universe, as Stokely Carmichael said, in a different context. But I do believe that is a danger, and I do believe that faculty have a responsibility to stay true to that original mission, and it's hard. It's difficult to juggle all those competing demands now. I think as a faculty member, I'm sure we all feel that in different ways. But if we lose the the ability to fund channels like NPR, if we lose the resources to put to that serious research and serious deliberation, then that's even more of a problem. And then social media becomes even more of a dangerous counter to that serious thinking.
Yeah, I'd just like to take a quick opportunity to tell some of the students out there about places like Fact Check, PolitiFact, Snopes.com, Hoaxy, the Washington Post Fact Checker. Use these sites, because that's the way you're going to be able to discern the true information rather than what somebody's trying to peddle on you. That was my commercial for as a librarian. So,
we have time for one more question.
Okay. Broadly speaking, and this is the other theme I'm seeing throughout this, without asking for any predictions, where do we go from here? Where do we go? How do we get students engaged? One individual offered says that students are taught to follow the rules in school even if you don't agree, and not to ever challenge them. How do we encourage challenge? How do we encourage engagement? We're all academics up here. How do we change the tone? What's next?
Resounding silence. What we're talking about is changing the culture, and there's no magic formula for that. I find it concerning that the student characterizes education as following rules or obeying, and so on. We come back to the issue of skepticism. I think as faculty and as citizens, we ought to foster skepticism. Not rude confrontation, but questioning. And I think that one of our jobs as faculty is to ask questions. Continually ask questions to the point at which students feel quite annoyed because we aren't giving answers. I think we can help students learn where to explore answers, but our job is really to help them learn that process of exploration, and I think that's largely done by asking questions, challenging each other, ourselves, our students.
Yeah, we need to model that behavior in the classroom, and then they'll pick up on that, and maybe they'll start practicing it themselves.
We need to look back and we need to look forward. We need to study those groups and individuals who did make change and did engage in the political process in ways that we now recognize as positive and useful and good. We need to see how they did that. I'm from Ireland, as you can probably tell, and I grew up in the context of basically a war there. Not exactly where I was from, but I see individuals now being called statesmen and honored for their contribution to what became the peace process. And 30, 40 years ago, those are not the labels that were being thrown at them at all. So I think we need to study more history, not less, and inform ourselves about the different approaches and mechanisms people took historically, and from there use that information to see what we can do on the local level. My colleague in history, Professor Lay, is a state rep. That thought was not in his head, arguably, 10, 15 years ago, and now it's very much a part of his identity. And it's useful for me to engage in discussions on the issues of the day. So, yeah, so as to what we can do, we can seek out ways that as individuals we can participate in the political process and take it from there.
It's a great start that the students have given us today, is showing that they're willing to participate, take some time out, take a little extra effort, and push beyond their boundaries.
So I think that was a great discussion. Thank you for all your questions. Dr. Cliff, you have any last words you want to?
Just stay engaged, stay involved. Read. Please read. Read something longer than 140 characters. You will learn more from a book, from an article, from an in-depth read than you will from listening to us talk, from checking your Twitter feed, from anything else. And I believe fundamentally in the power of democracy, but it requires, again, the people to be part of that democracy. So don't disengage, don't give up, participate.
All right. Well, thank you today for joining us for this very special panel. The questions were outstanding, and from hearing from all your perspectives is very enlightening. And we'll be back again soon. This was the Fitzwater Forum. Thanks again for joining us.